afternoon, everyone. My name is Christine Parthmore. I'm the CEO of the Council on Strategic Risk. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. We're really excited to have everybody here, including our special guests. For a little bit of background on our organization, the Council on Strategic Risk is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank dedicated to analyzing and addressing systemic risk to security in the 21st century. As such, a major focus of our work is seeking to improve capabilities for addressing biological threats of all kinds, in particular catastrophic biological threats, no matter what their source. Put simply, trying to prevent the type of catastrophic pandemic and biological event we're still experiencing with COVID-19 from happening again in the future. To this end, it's imperative that we learn lessons from the ongoing responses and those of the past few years as we look to shaping a better future. One critical aspect of this is the rapid development, manufacturing, and deployment of medical countermeasures for concerning pathogens, exemplified by Operation Warp Speed, an astounding U.S. effort to develop vaccines and therapeutics and other ways to address the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, our webinar will focus on Operation Warp Speed and some of the other types of collaborations that the U.S. government has led in recent years. And what has enabled these successes. In particular, we're going to focus on the public-private cooperation and partnerships that took place, as well as the collaboration across the U.S. interagency, in particular between the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Defense, among many other players that had to come together behind that incredible effort. Operation Warp Speed delivered amazing results in a very short time. Understanding the challenges of building on the strengths of this model will be key in enabling the rapid development and use of medical countermeasures to help future outbreaks as fast as possible. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our colleague, Council on Strategic Risk Senior Fellow Andy Weber, to introduce our special guests today.
Well, thank you, Christine, and thanks everybody for joining this Council on Strategic Risks event, especially the members of the Alliance to End Biological Threats, which has now grown to over 50 allies. We have some amazing speakers today. First will be Dr. Matt Hepburn, who is Senior Advisor on Pandemic Preparedness to the Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, Eric Lander, in the Executive Office of the President, aka Director of Mission Control for the Pandemic Prevention Plan. Prior to his role at OSTP, Dr. Hepburn directed COVID vaccine development under the Countermeasures Acceleration Group, formerly known as Operation Warp Speed, where he provided oversight for the investment in 6 COVID vaccine platforms. And I had my Moderna booster this morning, so I want to thank you, especially Matt, for making that possible. And it's just amazing to think of how successful OWS and the follow-on have been, and how many lives have been saved by your efforts. Matt, I'm going to call you Matt.
Yeah, please.
He also served as the Joint Project Lead of Enabling Biotechnologies for the Department of Defense Joint Program Executive Office for CBRN Defense, where he implemented the DoD Vaccine Acceleration Project, which provided investments critical to the initial actions for Operation Warp Speed. Dr. Hepburn had extensive experience across DoD. He was a colonel in the U.S. Army until his retirement. He served 6 years at DARPA, including running their pandemic prevention plan program, and where he invested in, among other things, mRNA vaccines and monoclonal antibodies and other platform technologies. He also served previously at the White House as Director of Medical Preparedness for the National Security Council. And it's just amazing to have him with us today. And we can't wait to hear, now that you're a full, maybe 2 weeks into.
I'm official. That's right. It's 2 weeks. Official. 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks. Look, I think we have a thing on the back here too in this conference room. So
that's fantastic.
Figuring it all out, figuring out where to take a Zoom call. That took me 2 weeks. So
that's great.
Yeah. So happy to plunge right in. What I wanted.
Matt, let me just before we do that, let me introduce Monique, our second speaker.
Oh yeah, please do.
Get that out of the way, and then
we'll just
get right into it. Yeah. Thank you. So we're also honored to have Dr. Monique Mansoura, Executive Director for Global Health Security and Biotechnology at the MITRE Corporation, where she focuses on the sustainability of the biodefense industrial base. At MITRE, Dr. Mansoura was also part of the COVID-19 Healthcare Coalition. I think it was her idea, actually, which brought together healthcare organizations, technology firms, nonprofits, academia, and startups in order to more effectively deploy healthcare resources. Dr. Mansoura has extensive experience in the biopharma industry, especially in building innovative public-private partnerships, and has been involved in some of the most vital scientific issues of our times, including the Human Genome Project. She led the policy planning and budgeting for a multi-billion-dollar medical countermeasure development and acquisition program in the United States under the authorities of Project BioShield Act of 2004 and the Pandemic All Hazards Preparedness Act of 2006. Her unique background, which cuts across industry, government, and academia, will lend a valuable perspective to our conversation today. I can't think of two better thought leaders. So we're going to begin by having some remarks from Matt Hepburn, and who's just a dear friend of decades, and I love him to death. And please start populating the Q&A with your questions so we can get right into those. I think Christine and I will have a couple of questions to kick it off. So go ahead, Matt.
All right. I'll try to be brief because that's always about the questions. And I really want to hear what Monique has to say. So just a few observations on Operation Warp Speed and a few observations on kind of the new role now and how they come together. I mean, I think the punchline message is that I think this awful pandemic, that there's been tremendous progress in some areas, and the strategy going forward is actually make sure that we take what actually worked pretty well or eventually worked and make that the new normal. And then we say, okay, here's how we're going to do even better. Here's how we're going to fill gaps where we didn't do so well. That's the plan. So I'd like to, the general comment on Operation Warp Speed for this audience especially is that, government can work. And for those, for the naysayers and the curmudgeons and everybody who, sort of says, well, has all these examples of where the government fails and it's too bureaucratic and everything else. I love having shining examples of where government can work. And there's dozens and dozens of examples in everyday life before the pandemic. And there's tons of heroes in the United States government, in the state and local governments, and public health and everywhere else. And certainly the private sector that did some things really well during this pandemic. But I do feel like that was catalyzed by the United States government, and that the federal government will need to continue to play a role in this space. And I would advocate for a very strong leadership role going forward. I think Andy alluded to this idea of where the Department of Defense and Health and Human Services came together, and that was magical. That was a unique. It was a unique blend of, I guess it was, maybe a better version of decades of cooperation. So I think as most of you are probably aware, the Department of Defense, where I come from, where Andy comes from, has maintained programs to address both naturally occurring infections and biological threats, intentional use of biological agents, things like that. And we've been doing that for a very long time. And we've worked with Health and Human Services ever since I started doing this 20 some years ago. But the collaboration has always been, you're doing this, you do this part, I'll do this part. And, sometimes that's complementary. Hopefully it's not in competition, and rarely it can be synergistic, but it's almost always been, we have our programs, you have your programs. Let's just tell each other about it. And Warp Speed broke the mold on that and said, there's one program. And when you reflect back on, April, I just remember like March and April and really in May when this was coming together. And it was like, well, as Andy mentioned, I had been working on trying to accelerate some different DoD technologies and getting monoclonal antibodies into the system, things like that. It was like, well, what's going to happen to my DoD programs, and what is BARDA going to do, and how's it all going to fit together? And it was like, just forget it. Okay, it's one program. Okay, it's one program. It's one team. It's one fight, and it's all going to come together. And it's like, well, I had this really cool program over here in DoD, and was it like, do we absolutely need it for Operation Warp Speed? And if the answer was no, then that program could maintain, but it wasn't going to be prioritized, and it wasn't going to be where we were going to put our energy. I think there was, leadership is about priorities, and with Moncef and General Perna, with John Mascola at NIH, with the BARDA team, I mean, we struggled, but we said, here are the priorities. Here. You remember too, it was, we originally started with vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. And not that diagnostics wasn't important, but, when we really considered it and started to go into the machinations of Operation Warp Speed, it didn't make sense to run our model similarly to vaccines and therapeutics. So you ended up with a RADx program and a lot of testing. We can talk about that another time. But the point is, it was about priorities, and it was about priorities, but it was really about bringing this one team together. And one of the remarks I make a lot about Operation Warp Speed and was from HHS people who said, I actually really had no idea that the Department of Defense did this. And what they meant by this, it was operational planning. It was operational planning. It was supply chain analysis. It was actually, cutting edge contracting using other transactions and really, really well negotiated contracts. And it's things that we as Department of Defense people were like, well, how could you not know this? I mean, it's like, that's what we do every day. And it's like, what do you think the military does? It plans operations. It plans contingencies. It plans for a living, right? And so, it was refreshing to bring the two cultures together, and I think for HHS to sort of see the value of that Department of Defense culture, and further, what was effective from a leadership standpoint, which came from General Perna on down, is that we're not going to be obnoxious. That it wasn't about, okay, we're going to come in and the Department of Defense is now in charge of the operation or anything else. Like the expression that General Perna used very frequently was leading from behind. And what he meant by that is contributing to the public health leadership, the public health expertise, the HHS expertise was the right folks to lead the response. The DoD, but we came in and said, hey, we have a lot to offer. And there, it was mutual respect on both sides. And that's not automatic, and that it starts at the top. And that's again where leadership was so powerful. I do want to make a couple, there's tons to talk about, but we'll leave it for question and answer. I want to transition a little bit more now into AP3, or the American Pandemic Preparedness Plan. So that's my purpose. I'm here for who knows how long, but I'm not here to do like 8 things. It is like, okay, here's the plan, make it happen. That's it. So for a former or current DoD guy, that's, music to my ears. You got a mission, clearly stated mission, and we can do great things once we've done that. And I give credit to Eric Lander, the team that's been here, to put that plan together and to make it public. Now it's not a detailed plan. It's not perfect. I think it's a great start. I think there's a lot of goodness in that plan. There's a lot we can work with. And right now we're going through a DoD process again called mission analysis, where we're figuring out, okay, what does it mean? How do we get it done? What do we want to tweak? And then, put together some different, big alternatives, course of actions, things like that. The part that we're struggling now, and I had some really nice conversations with Monique about this and others, is priorities. And so for anyone that's sort of served, this probably transcends kind of my experience, but of course it transcends my experience. But when you come over and work over at in like a national security council or in an OSTP type role, there's like 80 things, and everybody says, hey, my issue is most important. And the most challenging thing, and this is, I'll give, for those of you that know Carter Metcher, who kind of mentored me my first go around, he was like, look, you're only going to be able to get a few things done. you have to be very, very deliberate about prioritization, and just other people can do other things, or the departments can continue to do good work, and that's okay. But here at a White House level, you have to prioritize a few things. And it's really a struggle, frankly. What the good news that we've been doing so far is that if you look across, it's not just me, and it's not just the Office of Science and Technology Policy, but if we work across the different groups within the White House and then sort of leverage the best of our government, then we're going to be unstoppable. I kind of made that point today, and it was in the context of, when you can truly get the different expertise and resources of the federal government all rowing to the same cadence and moving forward, again, it's unstoppable. And the fun part now is that we have this really nice team. I think probably all of you know Beth Cameron, and over at National Security Council, and we have great people at Domestic Policy Council. It's a really nice group here who we can collectively, they'll have some priorities, we have some priorities. The magic, if we can pull it off, is kind of synchronizing those things. Where we're going to be spending good time in the space, at least out of the gate, in vaccines and therapeutics and diagnostics. And I think if you look at the publicly available plan, and then you go to the appendix, there's a lot more details, and so it's a good starting point for us. And I'll just make the comment: there's certainly loads to do in that space too. But what I'm excited about is looking at Operation Warp Speed, making the point of, we enjoy that we had the success that we did for about a minute, and then you kind of look, and there are a lot of things we could have done better, and there is a lot of things that I look back and say, well, I wish I would have thought of that, or I wish we would have put more here and put less there. There are tons of lessons there. Tons and tons that we can learn. And so derived from that, looking at, again, you can go to the AP3 plan and you can see it tick through. My final point along those lines, though, is that in the AP3 plan, we talk about viral families, and sort of this idea of, I think a lot of that's inspired by Barney Graham and the NIH, but the idea is that, could you say within these families, are the viruses similar enough where you can find a common targets? So could you get cross protection? Think about a universal influenza vaccine, or think about a universal coronavirus vaccine, or those types of actions. And the effort really proposes looking, developing vaccines kind of broadly, and seeing if we can develop see if we can come up with these cross-protective or universal vaccines. The reason why that's so important is that, and this isn't my own thought. I was on an NIH panel, and John Mascola brought this up, but and others were super articulate on this. Is that it turned out that the spike protein put into an RNA platform was incredibly immunogenic and protective. And that was not automatic. Like there was no like declaration that this spike protein is going to induce a long-term highly protective immune response. We didn't know that. We really had, a lot of it was based on previous coronavirus work, but it worked out, and it's good that it did. And we learned a lot. All the work in vaccines for the past 50 years, all of that current effort was built on those shoulders. But that may not happen again. And we may not figure out the right antigen, and we may not figure it out right away, or it may take 3 antigens, or it may take a bunch of trial and error with, 5 different vaccines in early studies before we can even select on the one to build. And so if that process takes a year, well, that would be disastrous, right? So we can't assume we're going to just pick the right antigen out of the gate, and we have to build out that capability that we can get to the right antigen really, really soon, and then solve the other, massive challenges of the scaling and the clinical trials and all that other stuff. So let me stop there.
Great. Monique, over to you.
Great, thank you. I hope it's, I'm not sure if it's a good or bad thing, but I think there's a lot of what's going to look like copy paste in my remarks to what Matt just said. And we didn't coordinate, we didn't plan. But it's clear we're aligned on some of the key issues and actions that are needed. So let me try and sort of recraft that in my in a slightly different way. Let me start with a disclaimer. Andy, the COVID-19 Healthcare Coalition, I'm immensely proud of what happened with that coalition last year, but it was not my idea. Industry and private sector came to us and was seeking leadership. They had a lot of capability. They had a lot of energy around wanting to contribute to the COVID-19 response. And with great credit to Jay Schnitzer, our Chief Technology and Chief Medical Officer at MITRE, we stepped up to play a coordinating role, stood up an ops center over a weekend after Friday, March 13th. And what started as half a dozen sort of interested parties from the private sector, including Mayo Clinic and some professors at MIT, evolved into dozens, then hundreds of entities that MITRE had the privilege of leading through much of 2020 to really harness, again, the capabilities. So I appreciate you acknowledging that. It's, again, something that not unlike Operation Warp Speed grew up organically, but, really rallied to contribute in a meaningful way to our nation's response. I want to thank Christine and Andy for leading and organizing this event and for everything that you're doing at CSR. It's a privilege to be on this panel with Matt, of course. I've known Matt for probably as long as the 20 years that I've been in this space in his roles at DARPA and JPO in the White House. Again, a real privilege. He talked and I'll talk a lot about how important leadership is, and I think we're looking at it on the other side of this panel right now, and we're grateful for it. What is critically important, I think, from my perspective, my 20-year arc of having been literally since 9/11 redirecting my career from drug development for rare diseases after the sequencing of the human genome for the first time, and working with Francis Collins on developing drugs for cystic fibrosis after he and teams around the world identified the gene, to really then wanting to redirect. The threat was real and present. It was clear we were vulnerable and we weren't prepared. That was the sort of post 9/11 sort of assessment. Here we are, fast forward 20 years later, much better capabilities. A lot of what has been built over the 20 years was leveraged in part by Operation Warp Speed and now the Countermeasures Acceleration Group. And just like Matt, a lot of soul searching. Keep the things that are good, build on the things that are good, recognize that not everything was executed or identified in a way that any of us is satisfied with. So I think we all, again, this is a tragedy of historic nature, the loss of lives and livelihoods, the asymmetric burden on the vulnerable and underserved populations. These are all critical issues that we never want to see again in any event moving forward. And that's his career commitment, life commitment, as well as mine. I've really benefited following my 15 years of government service from then going to business school and then transitioning that education into leading a business unit at a multinational pharmaceutical company, Novartis, that had a portfolio of contracts with the U.S. government and other governments around the world for pandemic preparedness and in leading centers for innovation and advanced development and manufacturing. And then for the past 4 years, being at MITRE and serving in a nonprofit organization that is neutral, objective, data-driven, evidence-based, and to really study the problem, having lived in both of the public sector and private sector entities that are central to the discussion we'll have today and central, I think, to mission outcomes. So with that as background and context, let me just set, number one, a core framework, and then 3 messages that I want to sort of start with. The core framework is in part the identity crisis of this mission space. And by that, I think we have all struggled, and many of us have said that this is a national security mission. I think, again, if you look at the devastation to lives, to our economy and economies around the world and lives around the world, there is nothing on par with this event with regard to those very, I think, fair metrics about the devastation of this type of an event. Yet, I think many of us will also recognize we don't have a seat at the national security table that gives us voice against these types of threats. I think with leadership like Matt, Pepper and Dr. Lander having a seat at the cabinet now, these are significant events, right? These are significant representations that having that voice and ideally also having the resources, and that's something I'll talk about a little bit later. So again, is this a national security mission? Yes. Is this a matter of economic security? Undeniable, right? Number one, just from the economic hit, that if we're not prepared, we can't absorb these kinds of shocks again. But as importantly, the critical role that the med tech industry, those that the vaccines, the therapeutics, the diagnostics, played to our bioeconomy. There was just a report from ODNI, from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, that was released on Friday that identified the bioeconomy as one of 5 core technologies that the U.S. must retain leadership if we want to retain a position as a superpower. So I think very appropriate that biotechnology, the bioeconomy was up there with the top 5, along with semiconductors, AI, autonomous technologies. The third lens, of course, is foundationally, this is a healthcare, this is a public health, healthcare, global health capability. Its day job, for developing drugs, vaccines, diagnostics, is to protect the health of communities. And so the health lens, the economic security lens, and the national security lens all need to come together and all need to be present as we're thinking about who needs to be at the table, how do we resource this, and to Matt's point, how do we prioritize? Because there's extraordinary competition on priorities for resources and talent. So that's the framework that I would ask us all to keep in mind as we think about, where's the seat and where's the table and who's got a seat at the table. The three core messages that I want to lay out just to start the conversation, again, really looking forward to the discussion, is number one, you have to start with clarity and consistency of your goals at a strategic level. What are you trying to do? And the American Pandemic Preparedness Plan is exactly as Matt said. It is that North Star. It is that aspirational goal. And it is not the end, but a beginning of a discussion. And Matt has demonstrated brilliantly, I think, over, since coming on board 2 weeks ago, his willingness to listen and engage with the community and sort of refine that plan and prioritize its goals. So defining the priorities, aligning across the ecosystem, both across the government ecosystem, which Matt talked about nicely, between HHS and DoD, measuring progress. How do we know if we're moving in the right direction toward what we're aspiring to achieve? And then financing. Execution is key. I am a big fan of the attributing this to an Apollo mission-like program because it had that clarity and that commitment of goals over time that was resourced and accountable. And I think that's exactly what we're looking for here. The other element is having those meaningful measures. I know there had been many efforts before this pandemic to assess how prepared we were. And it's one thing not to be prepared. It's another thing to be surprised that you're not prepared. And I think that surprise, that assessment of are we prepared and for what? I think that's, wanting to avoid fighting the last war is another core issue. And something Matt's talked about, and I know that it is core to the 10-point action plan MITRE has developed in consultation with world-class experts from around government, academia, industry, a 10-point action plan for sustaining a biopharma industrial base for a more secure nation. And that, again, is the culmination of really 20 years of experience from many of us in working with leaders like Matt, like Secretary Danzig and Governor Leavitt, who you might have heard out of at our Grand Challenge Power Hour last week. But test and evaluation is a core feature of that. How do you know? You don't know until you test and evaluate. I'm a baseball fan. I'm watching the World Series. These guys have been practicing since February, right? They didn't just show up in October. If you want to show up, in the World Series or at the Super Bowl, you got a lot of practice to do and training to do. And I think that's something that we have to invest in, we have to pay for, and that's absolutely critical. One of the lessons there is the value of a stockpile is not only the vaccines or whatever's in the stockpile, it's how did we get there? How did we make it? What did we learn? Who did we train? I think we have to reassess what the value of developing stockpile is. And I think that's been missing. And I think that's part of the inter-crisis business model, if you will. The second key, so the first was clarity of goals. Second, leadership and governance. Matt's already touched on that, so I won't say too much more here. Again, we're looking at mission control, and I think we're all excited about that. I think there's lots of things to learn about what was in statute currently the Public Health Emergency Medical Countermeasure Enterprise, or FEMC, and what role that played, what worked, what didn't work. I think we need to understand that as we're building mission control. And the third thing, again, is the who and the how. And this is really the who is industry. Industry is going to provide the goods and services that the government needs. And I hope we spend a lot of time in the duration of this. We talk about public-private partnerships. We talk about supply chain resiliency. What I really, and our MITRE team has really advocated is we need industrial policy. We need a strategic level look. We don't just need a transaction between our government and a company and a contract. We need to look at how our industrial base compares to that of others around the world, and what our capacities and capabilities are, and how we position the U.S. to not only to be able to provide for our population, but to be, I think, as we intend in global health security, a provider of these assets for many in the rest of the world who are less able to provide that. So industrial policy is something central to the work that we're doing at MITRE. I think it elevates the discussion. It's a leader-to-leader discussion between the CEOs in industry and the leaders in government. And then you can break it down to supply chain resiliency, but it really is that industrial policy that is core. And then, again, I touched on this, we'll need to talk about this, the realities of making a business case so that we sustain investments over time. We failed to do that time and time again in between the crises. We have financed this mission by supplementals, and so we're really looking to get to a steady state that will give industry in particular the confidence and credibility that we will be there over time in between events to build the capabilities that we will call on during the event. So I'll pause there.
Great. Well, thanks, Matt, and thanks, Monique. You touched on a few things. This national security imperative of preventing pandemics, and I also believe that having a good, strong system of early warning and rapid countermeasures, fast manufacturing, surge capacity can deter deliberate biothreats, and that very much needs to be a national security and defense mission. I worry a little bit about backsliding, frankly. After Operation Warp Speed, DoD seems to be going backwards. They disbanded their COVID task force. The Secretary's COVID advisor resigned, and their budget for the Chem Bio Defense Program, which is the premier program of DoD for countermeasure development and early warning, was cut 10% by the Trump administration and another 10% by the Biden administration. And I think Monique mentioned funding, the supplementals. We had a lot of supplementals, but it needs to get into the core budgets of the agencies. I've called for 10 plus 10 over 10, a $20 billion a year investment split between HHS, DoD, Department of Energy, Department of Homeland Security, sustained over 10 years for a $200 billion investment. And I think we can achieve President Biden's objective that he laid out in National Security Memorandum number 1 of a world safe and secure from biological threats, whether deliberate, accidental, or natural. So that needs to be the goal. My question for the two of you, and Monique, why don't you start since you mentioned stockpiling, and then Matt can follow up. How should we think about innovation, the government working with startups where the innovation really happens, and particularly as it relates to the programmable platforms for countermeasures and the manufacturing piece, that surge capacity? What's the right mix? How do we think about innovation in stockpiling and surge rapid manufacturing going forward?
Yeah, Andy, it's such an important question. Let me take that in a couple of parts. When you think about driving innovation and having scale to manufacture, I mean, this is something this industry does every day, right? This is their core mission, is to innovate new products, again, in the healthcare system, to protect and save lives. They have the large companies, again, I think what we've recognized here often have the speed and scale. This is in part, and Matt can speak more to this, the partnership between BioNTech and Pfizer. Pfizer had speed and scale as a large multinational pharmaceutical company. Moderna had to build it as it went, again, leveraging CDMOs and other capabilities that were established. So there's different models. But this is not necessarily a new model. I think about the very first medical countermeasure program the U.S. government had after 9/11, and that was ACAM 2000, the next generation smallpox vaccine. The innovation was at a small biotech company, ACAMBus. The industrial scale capability was provided through a partnership with Baxter that had the manufacturing know-how and could support the scale up and the development of product. Not unlike Operation Warp Speed, after 9/11, before the end of 2001, there was a commitment made by the U.S. government. Again, we had extraordinary leaders like D.A. Henderson and General Phil Russell leading the charge that made a commitment that we will have enough smallpox vaccine for every citizen. And those contracts were written, those commitments were made. Scale up was done, before we had phase 1 clinical trial results. So there's precedent. The question is, what happened in between? In part, that risk taking, that commitment. It's much harder to do in the preparedness phase than it is in the response phase. And I think trying to recreate Operation Warp Speed, or what we saw post 9/11 with the smallpox vaccine development program, and taking these bold, extraordinary risks is something we're all looking to, I think, retain for all future events. But industry, back to your point, what industry doesn't do is do things as fast as what the government will call for, right? So if we want that speed element in our portfolio, and we do, for threats both known and unknown, again, I think this is where we have to practice. This is where, and Matt's called out some great potential examples, whether it's Burkholderia or, the example I had was H7N9 in 2013 when we thought that might be the next pandemic. And you actually run the drill and you learn a lot. And you realize there might be capabilities you need where businesses need to make a B2B partnership. And businesses are good at that. Again, they do this every day. If they need a capability, they know how to find it. Now, if the government can facilitate or support that, that's an important role for the government to play too. But I think those are a couple of key points, Andy, as we think about tapping into the ecosystem, both the small innovative companies and the larger companies like Novartis. When I was there, we were privileged to have an mRNA DARPA contract, right? Back in 2013, 2014, a great DARPA program manager in Dan Wattendorf. And again, it's a great example of how the government was driving this technology almost a decade ago. The question is, was it managed like an Apollo mission project? Because that's part of, I think, where the opportunity is going forward is once you have one of those really promising technologies, how do you push it, to either fail fast or succeed brilliantly? So to Matt's point, you're not guessing if Spike is going to provide, sufficient immunoprotection when we knew coronaviruses were a threat. So I think there's lots of opportunity space here.
That's great, Monique. Thanks for that really extraordinary and comprehensive answer. Matt, what do you have to add?
That was awesome. Love the exercise thing. So that's, as General Furner would say, you and I are nested. That's what I always used to say. So, I mean, it's like, absolutely. And I think, I don't know what those exercises are going to look like. I think we shouldn't forget H7N9 is a great example, Monique. Like we're actually, first of all, we got to get through this pandemic, and we may have scenarios of COVID goes away for a while, and then we get a really nasty variant that kind of causes a wave in a year or two. I mean, who knows? We're in an unpredictable future. So I don't think. I don't know what's going to happen, but I don't think there's going to be a desert where preparedness isn't going to have much to exercise on. We may have to lean in a bit, and we may say, okay, H7N9 may or may not be bad, but we're going to lean in because not only are we going to get ahead of it, but we're also going to practice. I think Monique said something really, really cool in her comments, though. I want to highlight it on training. And I love that concept. The idea that we're creating a group of professionals in our government. And you can even say in the private sector allies and great people in biotech who are comfortable working in government type relationships, working in pandemic preparedness, and that we collectively are going to get better because we do these things. And the idea, like, well, we're developing a medical countermeasure, or even, as Monique said, we're going to stockpile a medical countermeasure because not only do we think we're going to need it, but we don't know, but also just going through this endeavor is going to allow us to get better at it. And it's like, well, why would we spend money on that? That could be a ton of money. Look at what the Department of Defense does for training. You know what I mean? Like, look at what the Department of Defense does for professional development. I mean, they'll send you to school for a year at a time, and you do, and then you kind of do more education, and you do more education. Like, it's a very deliberate process. That's not, and it's not like, oh, you have to have a product at the end of it. I mean, the product is that you are prepared and you're ready. And I think it's a kind of if we think about it, frame it that way, I think training regulatory expertise at the FDA, wouldn't that be a top priority? Training them in next generation manufacturing. Not that they need training more than I do or anybody else, but BARDA professional development and training plans. Why aren't we? It's always kind of like, well, we don't have money to do that. That's ridiculous. I think we need to train. And the best way, how does the military train? Well, you go to classrooms and stuff like that, and then they send you out in the California desert to the National Training Center. And that's not free. But that's what they do. And so I like this. If we can kind of accept that we're going to be going through, in quotations, exercises, not tabletops, but actually making products and driving that through. I think we'll be much better prepared. Monique also brought up industrial policy. I think that's really, really, really interesting. And it's, I think the playing field is now so different than it was pre-pandemic that this is a really interesting time to revisit the biotech ecosystem in our country and just lots of different things. And it's a nice issue to work at this level because it is very, very sort of cross-functional. So it's not an issue we would own as part of the pandemic preparedness plan, but it's an issue where we can be a good example of why we need it and why we need to do a lot of things differently. I guess my final comment on the stockpiles is that, I don't mind having stockpiles for current and future threats for the reasons Monique articulated. What I hope is that, number one, this is the argument for getting better at prediction. So we have a good idea on what's going to happen. If we predict better, we can start sooner. And it's also an argument for rapid scaling as well. And so I think we're going to get better in both of those areas where, I'm very excited, frankly, about the ability to kind of scale vaccine manufacturing. I think we're going to put a lot of energy and priority that. But I think that's going to be transformational as well.
And also distributed.
Distributed, yes. Scaled and distributed, yes.
Yeah. Sorry. Because we're at about 15 minutes left, we're going to go to some audience questions now, which I'm moderating here. But thank you. And also, we're 100% on board with ramping up testing and evaluation and making it annual, a regular cycle that we've been pushing for. So great to hear. Great minds thinking alike. Hopefully we can all push in that direction. One of the first questions was from one of the most talented people I used to work with at the Department of Defense, Kate Zander, that we'll throw it out. And I'm going to kind of riff on her question a little bit and weave together a few of your comments as well. So her question was how reliant Operation Warp Speed's success was on leadership. So in other words, did it come down to sort of personalities? And whatever degree that's the case, are there organizational processes and tricks that you can kind of get into the system as resilience in case that leadership at a given time of a crisis is not there? And I would say to put this together bigger as well, you both spoke about needing to prioritize bio issues as a national security issue and really carry that prioritization with it. I hope that we can get much more in that direction, in that mindset, and that bio just becomes a huge priority for the nation writ large, including in the national security side. Hopefully that will help resolve part of Kate's question. Our advocacy is sort of, let's do both. Let's create some institutional methods as well as try to grow good leaders and push sort of in both directions to be able to address biological threats better in the future. So curious if either of you have specific thoughts on this or specific tricks that you think should be adopted going forward.
Yeah, maybe I'll start briefly, and then I think it's to my previous point that leaders are trained, and training leadership in biodefense at the very at the company commander level all the way to the general level, like that's it's the military doesn't just take somebody and make them a 4-star general, right? It's a very deliberate career path. I think that should inspire across our government for those that work in the national security space, those that work in this biodefense space. So it wasn't like coincidental, like, oh, we were so lucky we had General Perna, and it's like, no, we had a 4-star general that was in charge of Army Material Command and one of the best logistic experts probably in our nation. Also, Moncef Slaoui from as a pharmaceutical executive, that was extraordinarily helpful. And so we do have to, one of the other things we got to get better at, and I know Monique, you totally agree with this, is like, it's good. Like I'm a career government guy, right? So I'm okay. It's great to have people who have really good private sector experience, and then they come into the government, and then it's okay if they go back out of the government, but then they can come back into the government. And sort of this idea of, hey, it's pretty easy for you to come in and learn about what we do, or maybe we'll bring you in to help us out during a crisis. I think an area where we really need help in that space is manufacturing expertise. That private sector expertise in our government would be incredibly valuable. So lots of interesting models there, but I don't think we can't rely on one-off leadership. My final point, though, is that when we talk about the Department of Defense, I probably should be a little bit careful, but I'll follow kind of Andy's lead on this. Is that it's a commitment that the Department of Defense is an instrument of national security. If so, as much as we would like to say the national security landscape will be static, and that'll give us plenty of time to have acquisition cycles and 10-year planning, and we can map out careers, and wouldn't that be great? It's not going to be. It's going to be ridiculously dynamic. And, so why, I think that the Department of Defense can't say we only do this part of national security. They have to say, look, we're going to be one of your go-to organizations during a crisis. And I mean, they did. Like Warp Speed is a small example, and we had, my military medical physicians and healthcare providers in the Javits Center in New York City, and the National Guard, and all these, and on and on and on. Thousands of examples where the Department of Defense contributed, and I think we have to sort of say, and DoD, we probably will next time too, if that's what our nation needs. And just sort of accept that.
Monique, do you have anything to add?
I think what Matt said, I would echo a lot of that. I think, again, training it, recognizing it where it is and where it isn't. I think, and we heard this from Secretary Danzig as well in his remarks to our MITRE Power Hour recently and to PCAST recently, right? You need to understand not only the science, leadership in science, but leadership in the management of science. I think what Moncef Slaoui is a pharmaceutical executive, having to make a lot of hard decisions, go, no-go decisions, portfolio strategy, really understanding that position and that capability, I think, is absolutely vital. I think understanding industrial policy, I think I love the idea that Matt brought up, that bringing that talent in, I think there's also a bit of a cultural issue that I think we have to take on head on, right? This a little bit of a industry is, they are part of the community, part of the first responders. They're not the enemy. They're not the dark side, right? I think we have to really view them as part of the solution, part of the team that is going to achieve the things we're all aiming to achieve. And I think many of us, I know I regularly run into sort of just a cultural sort of resistance to closer engagement with industry. There are issues of COI absolutely that need to be worked out. But I think a closer integration, my experience working in both worlds, again, a fish doesn't know water, right? The 15 years I spent in government, there was a lot of awakening when I got into industry and having to brief a CEO about justifying why a government partnership was in the company's best interest. And I think on the other hand, live a day in the life of Matt Hepburn in the White House, right? If you're coming from industry and all of the incomings constantly. So I think this exchange of leadership talent and training very intentionally is absolutely vital to the success.
Excellent. Thank you both. Next, I'm going to roll a couple of questions together. One is, what's the best structure, do you think, for Operation Warp Speed when it's not crisis time going forward? As part of that, are there a few parts where OWS fell short or took a wrong turn and had to correct? And what will you be taking from that as you think about helping to, in both of your cases, try to push ideas forward and help create what that future looks like?
Yeah, I'll highlight a couple and then turn it over to Monique. So I think first is maybe answer the second question first. Yeah, there's a lot to be learned from Operation Warp Speed, and we're going to incorporate that. I think a theme. Let me just give you an example theme. I think what the Food and Drug Administration did during this crisis was just extraordinary, and it wasn't just Operation Warp Speed. You look at I was recently in a conversation with the diagnostics about CDRH. I mean, literally reviewing hundreds and hundreds of emergency use authorization applications, and now they're getting hundreds more. So those professionals have been amazing, and they've been overworked, and they've done a really good job. I think it can be very transformational if they're on the cutting edge of next generation technology, and then they can provide clear guidance in that. And so that strikes me as really a point of emphasis, a lesson learned that wasn't necessarily. It was a lesson learned of some good things that happened, but also recognizing the enormity of the task that they are going to have, not only now because of Warp Speed or during the crisis, but we've set a new normal, in terms of the rapid, expeditious review of vaccine applications, and you can expand it accordingly. I think we've created an expectation. Frankly, that's probably a good expectation. If we have a new treatment for breast cancer, if we have a new treatment for all different lupus or all these different maladies that that are so devastating, we should be accelerating those too. And so it's an area where we want to set the new normal there. I think how do we make Warp Speed more permanent is a really interesting question that I haven't figured out, and I'd love to get feedback from Andy and your team on this. I think the FEMC is a great coordination mechanism. I think we should be really thoughtful on how to make it better. The beauty of Warp Speed was that it was temporary. I mean, it was no one's there sort of carving out your bureaucratic thing for the next 5 years or something like that. I mean, it was intended to be very temporary and very specific and mission focused. And that there's beauty in that, especially in our government. And so what we establish more permanent, I'm not sure. I kind of like the idea of saying we will construct task forces that will be Warp Speed like for a crisis response, but with the and exercise that we go back to that exercise theme. But the full intention is that it has a 1 year. It has an expiration date at 1 year, and that we're not gonna create a lot of additional bureaucracy.
Moni?
I can just build on that. Maybe we don't want a bureaucracy, but we do want performance, and we need performance in between crises. And so I think the question is, how do we develop that ecosystem of capability across the federal government and the multiple agencies, as well as with industry? Again, I think we're coming back to test and evaluation, because that's something tangible we can do that will give us confidence and credibility, not only in the technologies, but in our ability to work together. Right? That's as important. Can we contract in a way that is meaningful? Matt talked about the critical role that writing strong contracts played for both sides, right, of the contract agreement. The National Academies is currently reviewing the Public Health Medical Countermeasure Enterprise, and that report will come out soon, and that'll be important, as one more data point on, let's look at what happened between 2001 and 2020 in the establishment of Operation Warp Speed and learn from that as well. I know Helen Brenswell in part asked the question. She's done some brilliant writing on this. We need to learn from the lessons pre-Operation Warp Speed, pre-COVID-19 as well. A lot of the writing that she did, I think in early 2018 about who's going to answer the call, just because of the nature of the interaction between government and industry. And that's core and central to a lot that came out in our 10-point action plan about what happens in between crises. There has to be industry a struggle because they don't know who to go to in this complex government ecosystem. That's a fundamental recurrent failure that we've heard over and over as we've engaged in the industry. So I think there has to be, I don't want to say permanence, as long as these threats are out there, there has to be some sort of structure where industry knows where to go in a meaningful way that will provide consistent, clear guidance on what are those goods and services that the government needs to draw down risk.
Excellent. And then since we're down to the last few minutes, I will take the liberty of the final question and pose it to all three of you, with Andy going last. And that is with all the tragedy and hardship, as well as amazing efforts by so many people over the last few years, can you share one thing that gives you hope in terms of our ability to effectively address biological threats going forward? We'll go Matt first, then Monique, then Andy.
Yeah, I've done these panels. I quote this one number, and it may not even be right, but as I understood pre-pandemic, the world would produce approximately 4 billion doses of vaccine a year. All vaccines, every single flu vaccine and everything else. We're getting up to 9 billion doses produced by the end of 2021, and the capability to produce even more and to frankly distribute them to a world population. You just think about the extraordinary accomplishment of the United States, but of really the global community in that. Should have been faster and got it. We have lots more work to do on it, but just think about that. Think about what then we can do against other vaccine preventable diseases and cancer and everything else. If all we have to do is just leverage that massive collective effort and keep it going and make it better. Sky's the limit in what we can do.
Thank you. Monique, point of hope.
Christine, I'll come back to where we started, leadership and mission control. Looking at the guy on the screen here, Matt Hepburn, his statement, his clear owning this mission, and I can remember exactly the words. It makes him happy to know that he stepped in to own this responsibility, right? That gives me great hope because none of this happens without great leadership. And I think we're looking at it right here on the screen. So it starts there, and that gives me a lot of hope for the future.
I would echo that back. A characteristic of yourself in this time as well, and add you to that category. Definitely agree. Thanks. Andy.
It's great. It's easy. The one thing, it's already been done, creative mission control at the White House. We put Matt Hepburn in charge with Monique as the wing person. It's just, it's that moment in time, once in a generation, once in a lifetime. We got to do it right this time. We got to resource it. I think 10 plus 10 over 10, $200 billion over the next decade is a reasonable investment. And it needs to be a defense and national security priority so we can make this the last pandemic.
Cheers to that. Thank you, Andy. And again, I would echo that word investment. These are not dollars that are going up into the ether. They are dollars that are contributing to a vibrant economy and to our science and technology base and manufacturing base, and saving lives, potentially at a really grand scale. So thank you all for that, for all of your comments and for joining us. And in particular, thank you for your efforts in recent years to create, I think, the starting point of a really bright future for rapid development and manufacturing of medical countermeasures like the world has not ever had before. And again, hopefully this is just the starting point. Thank you again for your time, and thanks to everyone for joining us. Thank you again so much. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.